Welcome to an introduction to New Testament textual criticism. This is going to be a lay course, although we get into some of the details of the Greek, and I'll try to explain that as best I can as we go through. I want to give you an overview of what this will be all about to begin with. And first of all, the introduction proper. We're going to talk about the definition and the goal of textual criticism, how to count textual variants. And that might seem like a very simple and obvious thing, but there's two different ways in which they've been counted. One is the right way, one is definitely the wrong way. The number of textual variants, these are also known as readings. That is the wording that is different from one manuscript to another. That's a variant or a reading. The nature of variants, recent attempts to change what the goal of textual criticism is. And each one of these is a separate lecture. Then we'll look at the materials and methods in making ancient books. And then the materials for doing New Testament textual criticism. This will include the history of the transmission of the text, that is from ancient times until the time of the printing press, and it's a brief history looking at some of the aspects of what's happened. Illustrations of scribal corruptions, and we'll be looking at that in two different ways. One is unintentional changes. What ways did the scribes change the text that they did not intend to change? And then we'll illustrate scribal corruptions that are intentional changes. And you might say, wait a minute, scribes actually intended to change the text? Well, yes, they did. Many times they did so. Most of the time they did so probably because they thought the scribe who wrote before them had made mistakes, and so they're correcting those mistakes. But by making that correction, they actually are introducing new mistakes. But we'll look at those kinds of things, and we have very clear documented evidence of the kinds of mistakes that scribes made. Continuing on with materials for doing textual criticism, we're going to look at some famous papyri, famous manuscripts. P52 is an extraordinarily important papyrus because it's, at least at this stage, the earliest known Greek New Testament copy of any size, of any passage of the New Testament. The Chester Beatty papyri, these are housed mostly in Dublin, although there's one leaf in Vienna, and there's 30 leaves of this at the University of Michigan. But the Chester Beatty papyri have they include the earliest copy of Paul's letters, the earliest copy of Mark's Gospel, earliest copy of Revelation, and not to mention a number of very important and early Old Testament manuscripts. Then the Martin Bodmer papyri. The Bodmer papyri are manuscripts that are housed for the most part in Geneva, Switzerland, or more correctly, Cologne, Switzerland, which is in a little village on the edge of Lake Geneva. And we'll talk about what they are and where they are now, because there's been some shifts in the last few years. And then the most famous Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus probably our two most important New Testament manuscripts, both from the 4th century and both originally containing the entire Bible. We have a grand total of 4 early manuscripts that almost surely contain the entire Bible originally. They're all from the 4th or the 5th century. And so we'll be talking about all 4 of them. Then the next 2 will be Codex Alexandrinus and then Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. Codex Alexandrinus is in the British Library, and Ephraemi Rescriptus, also known as Codex C, is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. These are 5th century manuscripts, again, very, very important. Then the most bizarre manuscript of the New Testament is Codex Bezae, named after Theodore Beza, not because Beza was bizarre, but because his manuscript was bizarre. And in fact, he gave it to the University of Cambridge with a letter in 1581 where he said, you know, this manuscript is really eccentric, and I figure that Cambridge University would be the one place that would know how to handle it, would accept it well, appreciate it. It almost looks like a double entendre. I had the opportunity actually to read the letter back in 95 and then spend a day with the manuscript. But is this a dig against Cambridge? I'm not sure. But then there's Codex Washingtonianus, which is in Washington, D.C. It's the most important New Testament manuscript that we have in the United States. And it's a late 4th, perhaps early 5th century. And like Codex Bezae, it's a Gospels manuscript. And like Codex Bezae, it has the order of the Gospels differently than what we have in what we traditionally know as the gospel order. Instead of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the order it has in these two manuscripts is Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark. And the reason for that, it's called the Western order. The reason for that is they wanted to put the apostles first, and then they put Luke next, and then Mark last. Some have suggested that the earliest form of the codex that had all four gospels in it would have been in this Western order. And that's going to become an issue that we'll wrestle with later on as we look at the ending of Mark's gospel. There's all sorts of fun things we'll be getting into in these lectures. And then continuing on with materials for doing textual criticism, we'll talk about resources for New Testament manuscripts. The resources are so vast that I had to limit it to things essentially that you could access through the internet, rather than saying, here's about $5,000 worth of specialized books that you guys need to get if you want to learn about textual criticism. All of this is on the internet, and all of it is free. The Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany, which has an English site. This is the granddaddy of all text critical institutes, and it's got some very important materials on their site. We'll talk about how to use these sites as well. The British Library. Both Codex Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus sit next to each other in the British Library, in the same room that the Beatles' White Album is in. First edition, of course. Then there's the Evangelical Textual Criticism website coming out of Cambridge University from Tyndale House. And they've got some really nice discussions of things. And finally, we'll talk about the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. That's the one I know the most about, and so it will get its own separate lecture. Also because I'm giving the lectures and it's my center, so I get to do that. And then we'll talk about the methods for doing textual criticism. We'll discuss the Greek text behind the King James Version. There's a lot of things that most people simply are unaware of as far as the Greek text is concerned that was used for the King James Version production. That text is known as the Textus Receptus, and the Textus Receptus actually was part of an advertising blurb that came out in a Greek New Testament 22 years after the King James Bible was produced. In 1633, the Elzevirs, an uncle and his nephew, produced a Greek New Testament where they said, here's the text that's been received by all. So it's the received text, if you will, the Textus Receptus. And we'll talk about the Textus Receptus and the doctrine of preservation. It'll be an important thing for us to wrestle with, whether there is such a doctrine, and if so, does it mean that that Greek New Testament is the one that God has preserved? And we'll discuss the history of the discipline since the TR, or the Textus Receptus. If we go all the way back to the first published Greek New Testament done on a printing press, it was Erasmus's Greek New Testament published on March 1st, 1516. It was originally called Novum Instrumentum, but we will call it Textus Receptus as the term that has been adopted for that basic kind of text that's essentially Erasmus's text from 1516 for many years, even a couple of centuries afterwards. And we'll discuss the discipline since his text was published. And we'll talk about the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of the most fascinating discoveries of a New Testament manuscript ever. In fact, Tischendorf, this fellow who discovered it in 1844 and 1859, is probably the man after whom Indiana Jones was patterned. They don't look at all alike, but nevertheless, it seems that they were taking a page from Tischendorf's life to come up with Indiana Jones. He'd pack his gun to drive off the snakes and the wolves and things like this in the Middle East. It's fascinating. And we'll talk about Westcott and Hort, two very evil men, according to some, who were part of the occult, according to some, and the dethroning of the Textus Receptus. We'll talk a little bit about their lives, but especially their theory and how they ended up dethroning this Greek New Testament that had been the standard text since 1516. And we'll discuss the methods for doing textual criticism, principles of reasoned eclecticism, which involve looking at the information internally as well as externally. That is, what is the scribe likely to do? What is the author likely to have written? That's the internal evidence. The external evidence has to do with, let's evaluate these manuscripts in terms of their date and their character. Let's look at manuscripts that are in a group, a particular family. What are the best family representatives? What are the best manuscripts that represent that type? It's kind of like my family and I used to show dogs, and so when you show a dog, it has to conform to that family. You have to show its bloodline to show that it's a pure dog. We don't have any of that for these manuscripts. There's not a single manuscript that is a pure bloodline for any family group. But even those that are pure line dogs, some of them look a little bizarre. We showed beagles, and there were some dogs that I'd swear were not beagles that were in that dog show. But you're looking for the best kind of a representative of that particular type. A good-looking beagle is not a good-looking basset hound. It's not a good-looking Labrador. They're different, and we need to keep those kinds of things in mind as we look at this. And then you also look at geographical distribution, a very important issue of when there's a particular reading, the wording of something that we find in some of the manuscripts. Let's say we find it in a church father in the 3rd century in Carthage, and we find it in a Latin manuscript in Rome in the 3rd century, and we also find it in Greek manuscripts in Egypt. Well, you start putting those things together, you say, this same wording is found in 3 different witnesses over a widely disparate geographical region. Maybe there's something to it. Maybe it goes back to an earlier ancestor, and that's how we're going to be putting it together. And we'll sum that up and show how these two halves work, the internal evidence and the external. So you're going to get a lot of material on textual criticism, and yet, frankly, it's just, to call it the tip of the iceberg would be an injustice to textual criticism, because you're not even getting the tip of the iceberg. If the tip of the iceberg had a tip, maybe that's what you're getting. But we'll still be covering enough to make you really dangerous, I think. All right, then we'll talk about some famous textual problems, and we will be looking at textual problems that are in the Gospels, in Paul's letters. We'll look at some in other parts of the New Testament as well, and we'll include the 2 most important, or I'd say the 2 biggest textual problems in the New Testament in terms of the number of verses. Mark 16, 9 through 20, and John 7, 53 through 8:11. Those 2 passages involve 12 verses each, and there's a lot of emotional baggage that's attached to them in terms of are these authentic or not, and the people who fight over them, it's pretty dramatic and fascinating. Nevertheless, these 2 passages, we'll see if they affect any doctrines, and we'll also ask the question, are there other passages that are like this? The reality is, no, they're not. These are the largest passages by far of any textual variants. The next largest is 2 verses, and we have about 24 places where we have 1 or 2 verses. Then everything else after that is much smaller. So that gives you a basic overview. Then we're going to sum all this up and review some of the material in asking the questions what we have now, what they wrote then. So that gives you an overview of the course, and I'm exhausted just thinking about all these things. All right, let's begin with an introduction, definition, and goal of New Testament textual criticism. In general, we can say, and by in general I mean not related to the New Testament, but for any ancient document, we can say that textual criticism is the study of the copies of any written document, and by that we mean the handwritten copies of any written document whose original, which is often called the autograph, and I'm throwing some new terminology at you. There's a whole vocabulary you have to learn for textual criticism, but it's important to think through some of these. I'll keep it at a minimum. Whose original or autograph is unknown or no longer existent. for the primary purpose of determining the exact wording of the original. We even have to do textual criticism on documents that were written after the printing press was invented in 1454. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We don't have the original document that Lincoln wrote out. What we have is 5 very early copies that were written, they're first generation copies written by his secretaries, and we have hundreds of people who were there when he gave the Gettysburg Address, journalists who took notes and published what he had to say in their newspapers. And so even on things during the era of the printing press, it's sometimes difficult to get it exactly right. But for the ancient documents, for the ancient world, we have virtually no original documents of any ancient literature. Now, we have original documents of non-literary things. A husband writes to his wife and says, please pick these things up at the grocery store. The son writes from the battlefield to his dad and tells him how the fight's going. Those are non-literary texts. As far as literary texts, we have virtually nothing. We have a scrap of 1 or 2 classical authors, just a few verses, and that's it. Now, for the New Testament, textual criticism is the study of the handwritten copies of the New Testament, whose original, that is, the autograph, is unknown, or I would say non-existent. It's fell apart within 100 years of being written, for the primary purpose of determining the exact wording of that original text. That's the fundamental goal. So the definition and the goal of textual criticism are virtually identical. Now, why is textual criticism necessary for the New Testament? Well, the reason it's necessary is that, first of all, the autographs no longer exist. We don't have them anymore. Instead of the autographs, we have copies. They almost surely disappeared, as I suggested, within a century, and they would have been written on papyrus. Papyri, literary papyri, that is fairly decent quality papyri, that are used, occasionally, more than every few years, where someone has this as part of the library in their own home. They would have these papyrus rolls, and they'd have tags that they would attach to the papyrus roll to say, this is what this document is. And so there have been some studies very recently done that have suggested that these literary papyrus rolls that were used on a semi-frequent basis would last sometimes 200, even 300 years. Well, you compare that to the New Testament documents. We're talking about something that's not read just for literature. It's read because life is at stake, and life of a religious group that is persecuted, and they have to get this stuff right, and they have to get it disseminated. So these manuscripts would have been examined very frequently, and you can easily see a scenario like this. Paul writes a letter to the Romans. The Romans get a copy. Other churches find out, oh, you got a letter from Paul. Could we get a copy of that? And so the Romans write out a copy, send it to these folks, and they come across another copy of Paul's letter written by somebody else, copied by somebody else, and they said, wait a minute, there's some discrepancies between these two. Well, maybe we should send somebody to Rome to sort this thing out and take a look at the original document. This kind of thing must have happened over and over again. And so the original New Testament manuscripts would have worn out from being read out loud and from being copied so frequently. And so most scholars are quite convinced they would have just fallen apart within a century of their production. Well, so they no longer exist. The second reason why textual criticism is necessary is because there's differences among the copies. In fact, there's between 6 and 10 differences among the 2 closest early manuscripts we have per chapter. Well, you multiply that out by 260 chapters, we've got over 2,000 differences among these manuscripts. That's quite a few. And so then you look at manuscripts that don't agree with each other very much. Now we're looking at a pretty sizable number. Now, if we still had the autographs, then textual criticism would not be necessary. Why do it? You got the original, we know what it says, that's fine. But if we didn't have the autographs and yet all of the copies were exactly alike, then textual criticism would not be possible. It's not that it wouldn't be necessary. They might be all exactly alike based on a later copy. So it might still be necessary, but something that couldn't be done. This is, to a degree, that second category is to a degree what Muslims face. They claim that all copies of the Quran are exactly alike, which is actually not at all the case. But what we do know historically is that Caliph Uthman, the leader of the Muslim religion, within a few decades after Muhammad had lived, gathered up all the copies of the Quran. There were quite a few of them that were rather disparate from one another, and he burned all of them except his one preferred copy. And so then there were strong penalties about making any kinds of errors in the copying of the Quran from that point on. Well, that's very good for the history of the Quran after that point. It doesn't help us at all for recovering the Quran before Caliph Uthman came along. And so even Westcott and Hort talked about this, saying it's not possible to get back to the original Quran because Caliph Uthman destroyed all those earlier copies. So if we had the autographs, it wouldn't be necessary. If all the copies were exactly alike, textual criticism would not be possible. What's interesting is that even Bart Ehrman has a view that is very similar to what Muslims have about their own sacred texts. In fact, Ehrman's view is along the lines of what Textus Receptus people have. These folks who are King James only and God inspired only one text, and it's this Greek New Testament that Erasmus put together. They tend to say that's exactly what the original text said, and Ehrman has argued that if God took the trouble to inspire the texts, then he should have taken the trouble to preserve the text exactly in every single manuscript. Well, his problem with Christianity is that it's not Islam. His problem with the bibliology of us dealing with the text of the New Testament is that he wants it to be like what the Muslims claim for Islam and what KJV only people claim for the Textus Receptus. And yet no Christian theologian throughout the last 2,000 years has ever suggested, oh yeah, this is what we expect, that the text has been preserved exactly in all the manuscripts just like the original. But that's what Ehrman wants. So in a sense, you might say he's disappointed with the way God has done things. We'll talk about his views as we get into this course. Okay. Well, in this respect, textual criticism is no different from the textual criticism for any other major religion. That is, the New Testament textual criticism is no different. That is, we don't have the originals. The copies differ. And I said that Muslims argue that all of their copies are exactly alike, and yet even the Quran has manuscripts that have errors in them, although this has not been admitted by Muslims. The Quran is starting to be really seriously investigated by scholars in the last few years, and it's ramping up. Some Christian scholars and others who are examining the Quran, sometimes when a fatwa is put on their head for doing so. But here you have, for example, a leaf of a Quran manuscript that's got several erasures and rewrites in it. And this is a short leaf, very minimal text, and yet you see half a dozen places where the text has been erased and rewritten. There have been some Quran manuscripts that have been found recently that are in the process of being published that are known as palimpsest. That is, they're parchment manuscripts where the text was scraped off and that was reused and more text was written on top of it. The undertext is Quran and the upper text is Quran, but they don't say the same thing. And so you wonder why that happens. Well, it seems to have happened because these scribes felt that we can't have any mistakes in the Quran, and therefore to make sure that we don't have any mistakes, we'll just erase that undertext that has those mistakes and create new ones. And now with some phenomenal technology, we can read that undertext that we did not know existed before. So the secondary objective, let's get back to the New Testament. The secondary objective is to trace the changes to the text in various places and times to gain a window on the shape of ancient Christianity. It's important for us to know how the Christian faith was played out, was worked out, was viewed in various regions in the ancient world. And what you need to recognize is this. The text that these people inherited, the one that they used, is the one that they considered to be the authorized, authoritative scripture. Just like in England, after 1611, the authorized scripture is the King James Bible. That's what God must have inspired. And that's what they used for centuries. Or the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, that was the principal text used by Roman Catholics for over a millennium. That is the inspired scripture. And whether those things match the original or not, the fact is that they are still what Christians in those parts of the world in those times are regarding as scripture. And so it's interesting to see what they consider to be scripture, and it's also interesting to see how they change scripture to fit in with their own cultural needs. There's going to be some things that they do that may be a little bit disturbing to us. But we also need to distinguish between manuscripts of the New Testament and manuscripts of other early Christian writings. For the most part, other early Christian writings are far more corrupt than New Testament manuscripts, especially those that were produced by heretics, or at least not people that were squeaky clean in their orthodoxy. Let me give you an illustration. The Gospel of Thomas had major textual upheavals. The Gospel of Thomas is not a Gnostic gospel, as many people think it is. It's kind of Gnostic-like or proto-Gnostic, or at least open to becoming Gnostic. It was found, the only full copy we have of it was found in Nag Hammadi in 1945. And we've discovered also at least 3 Greek fragments that we didn't know were part of the Gospel of Thomas until this whole gospel was published. But these fragments began to surface in the late 1800s. Nobody knew what they were. And they said, oh, the Gospel of Thomas, they're part of this. But when comparisons were made between the two, there was upheaval in the order of these sayings of Jesus and what the actual words were. The text really went through some significant changes. And Tim Raschuti has done the work on this. He was an intern of mine at Dallas Seminary. He studied Coptic and Greek and wrote a chapter in a book that I edited. The chapter is called Tracking Thomas, a text-critical look at the transmission of the Gospel of Thomas. And he compared the Greek fragments with the Coptic in the places where they line up. And this was in Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament, a text that I edited for Kriegel in 2011. Important chapter, and these are important things for us to think about, that when it comes to the corruption of the New Testament, it doesn't go through the same kind of upheaval and really massive alteration that other ancient texts, even other ancient religious texts, go through. Well, until a few years ago, everyone thought that they knew what original text meant. But in 1999, Eldon Epp, who's kind of the dawn of North American textual critics today, wrote a very important article called The Multivalence of the Term Original Text in New Testament Textual Criticism, done in Harvard Theological Review. Now, Epp kind of stirred the pot, and it got scholars to think about what they meant by original text. And here's some of the different definitions that he suggested, and we're going to land on one, and that's how we'll end this lecture. He says one would be the predecessor text form, that is the form of the text before it was published, maybe the working text that an author used. So if John's writing the Gospel of John, he may have the text of his gospel that's kind of the one that he's going to mark up and edit and things like that. The second one would be the autographic text form, the form of the text when it's dispatched from the author. And that's the one that I think is by far the one that we really need to take into consideration. It's the one, frankly, that virtually all New Testament scholars, until Eldon Epp wrote this article, thought was the original text. And then when he wrote the article, people got confused and said, well, what do we mean by original text? But I'd say most New Testament scholars still think when they talk about original text, they're talking about the last form of that text that was under the control of the author. As soon as he dispatched it, as soon as he sent it to his audience, no longer does he have control over it. So it's that last form when he dots all of his I's and crosses all of his T's, and that's the way he wants it to look. That's the autographic text. That's the original text, not the working drafts that he's been editing and changing before it gets published. Then there's the canonical text form, the form of the text when New Testament books became canonical. That is, when they were considered as scripture. And there's some questions about whether textual problems were a part of what was considered in the whole discussion. In other words, take Mark 16, 9 through 20. Did the early church feel that Mark's gospel was scripture only if it included those 12 verses, or only if it excluded those 12 verses? Or was that an irrelevant question to them? Was it the book itself that was considered canonical, even though there was a recognition that there's textual variants that may not be yet resolved? And finally, there's the interpretive text form, the form of the text in a given locale with interpretive alterations to the text. And that's the form of the text that any given area is going to have until the time of the printing press has to be different from the form of the text in any other area, because these are handwritten manuscripts. They won't be identical. So what are we considering to be the original text? Well, the common sense approach is to embrace definition number 2, the document that left the author's hands as it was dispatched to the primary readers. It's the last stage of the text while under the author's control. And this is also known as the autographic text, or the autographs. Autographa is another term that is often used, or the Ausgangstext. The Ausgangstext means the exit text, as it exits the realm of the author. This is what we mean when we are speaking of the original text. Well, now you have a basic introduction to the discipline, and you understand what the goal is, or has been, the primary goal of textual criticism and its secondary goal.
Hello, this is Tim. I'm the Executive Director of the Credo House, and I hope that you've been enjoying and loving these Credo courses. Just want to take a quick second that what you see, what's happening in the background there, that is not a production studio that we made just for the Credo courses, but that is called the Inklings Room. The Inklings Room is just one of the 3 rooms at the Credo House. Right now, I'm in the big room where you can hear a latte machine going on behind me, music happening in here. We typically get several hundred people every week coming in our doors, where we are what we think is one of the most unique evangelistic places that exists, where we just want to be on the front lines of the intellectual persecution of the church today. And so we invite you that if you're ever in Edmond, Oklahoma, to come and get a latte from the Credo House, hang out here, but then go into the Inklings Room where we film the Credo courses. It's a great room. We can tell you about the history of the Inklings, tell you about that room, and then our other super secret map room as well. But you can learn about that at credohouse.org, or we invite you to come and hang out with us over a Luther latte at the Credo House.